Okay, I think this is a good enough critical mass. Let's get started. So this elective is going to cover debating Marxism versus planless affirmatives. So I broke this up into a couple pieces. Like we'll talk a little bit about why learn about it at all. We'll talk a little bit about some theory and definitions. We'll talk about Marxist theses on alienation, which I think have a pretty good relationship with critical affirmatives. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how to debate it. Okay. So first thing, why learn it? So a couple of reasons. First is judge adaptation. Not every judge wants to hear topicality United States federal government with fairness. It's just kind of a reality of the activity. So having sort of the Marxism critique in your arsenal is useful. The second is the 1AC that's written, that is planless, is likely written to answer topicality. In fact, in sort of my experience, it's been the case that almost all 8 minutes of the 1AC is sort of focused on trying to answer topicality arguments, right? Usually it's not the case that a 1AC is focused to answer Marxism. Like it might talk about Marxism for a second, but it's not like the whole 1AC is geared to do that, okay? And then lastly, it's less telegraphing to the opponent. So usually when you think of teams that are like T-cap and case, like that's like a surefire way to know that they're going for T, because they're probably not going to be able to explain the cap gate to you, so they're going for topicality, right? So you want to be able to expand the range of options you have. So just like you have a more prolific 1C when you're reading a more sort of traditional strategy against a plan, right? It's like you want multiple options that you can go for in the negative block. I think those things are largely self-explanatory. Second part of this is going to be like theory and definitions. So just sort of want to start by saying like debaters usually do a pretty poor job of articulating critiques of capitalism because they sort of lack a mastery of the terminology and understanding of the history of Marxism and then some of the offshoot movements. Usually it's because you're like the Capke, we have it in the 1NC, cross-examination happens, you sort of get obliterated, and then it's like, yeah, we'll just give it to the 1NR and hopefully things go okay. It's like, yeah, like I get it. But it's like being able to sort of understand and talk through some of this terminology is important. So to that end, kind of want to define a couple of things pretty precisely. The first one, what is capitalism? What is capitalism? Capitalism is the privatization of the means of production. It is the privatization of the means of production. Okay, so what it's not? It's not about the printing of money or the existence of an economy or a market, right? So a communist government still has money. So it's not like accumulation of money is the problem. It's not like communist governments don't have markets either, right? The sort of big question is, there will be money, there will be economies, there will be markets, but there's sort of like two important parts of that definition, right? The first is the idea of privatization. Okay. Privatization is derived from the idea of individual property rights, that some property can be owned privately rather than publicly. Okay. The second sort of part of that definition, means of production. Okay. It's also called capital goods for those of you who are more econ based. They're basically the physical inputs used in the production of economic value. So think in terms of like raw materials or facilities or machinery or tools that are used to produce the goods themselves, right? So Marxists generally agree that sort of the capitalist class or the bourgeoisie, you might have seen Bourgiou, no wait, Geoisie, bourgeoisie, right? So basically the capitalist class is the one that owns the means of production, right? It's not something that is publicly owned by sort of the entire populace, okay? What are some alternative economic philosophies espoused by Marxists, if not capitalism? So in debate, we kind of have a tendency to assume that communism and socialism are interchangeable and sort of the same thing, and that maybe there's a single kind of orthodox Marxism rather than many Marxisms with many people who disagree. I think the more you sort of describe your K as sort of generically orthodox Marxism, or just like all of it is the same, the more that you're likely to lose the debate. So similarities between all these things. So similarities between like socialism, communism, and some of these other movements is that they're advocating public rather than private ownership or property rights, right? The big differences. So let's start with socialism. So what is socialism? So defining it. Under socialism, individuals can still have private ownership of land and property, but industrial production, or the chief means of generating wealth, is communally owned and managed by a democratic government. I'll repeat that sort of definition again. So socialism, individuals might still have private property, But industrial production, so the chief means of generating wealth, are communally owned and managed by a democratic government. Okay. So in general, socialism tends to be less rigid and more flexible. So for some, socialism can coexist alongside a capitalist government, right? Or capitalist economy. Like that's decisively true of the US. So like see Bernie Sanders, right? He has a democratic socialist platform that can coexist with certain elements of capitalism, right? Or programs that were once considered socialist, so like Medicare and Social Security, right, were considered socialist because it is the sort of public driving ownership of some of those things, right, can coexist with, other parts of American life that are fairly capitalist. I think even for more anti-capitalist socialists, right, they seek non-reformist reform, and they sort of insist on making changes through a democratic political structure. So that's sort of that second part of the definition of socialism, is that they are democratic. It's not like a vanguard party that is a dictator that determines everything top down. They think that sort of decisions should be made through democracy. What does this mean for a debate? So in debate rounds, socialism tends to sort of translate to left defenses of governmentality against AFFs that are firmly anti-civil society, right? So usually the story goes something like, capitalism has hollowed out a bunch of important programs, right? So Medicare, Social Security, the idea of public ownership is being slashed, and only sort of the state and state programs can end material afflictions that solve things like poverty, global warming, etc. Right? And they'll say that the affirmative sort of refusal of a public, commons. I think many of you may have heard the phrase state phobia, right? It's like the refusal of the state and the refusal of the commons is the thing that plays right into the hands of the capitalist class. So it tends to be sort of more a defense of the democratic state and the possibility of reform. Okay. In contrast, what is communism? Okay. What is communism? Under communism, there's no such thing as private property. Okay. All property is communally owned, and each person receives a portion based on what they need. There's a strong central institution. So maybe a state, maybe a vanguard party that controls all aspects of economic production and provides citizens with basic necessities. So the strong central party tends to be critical of democratic reform within the old regime. So one of the sort of biggest adherents to sort of communism is Karl Marx, right? You may actually not be aware that his work, the Communist Manifesto, which you've probably heard about, has sort of a big criticism that is written in response to earlier socialism. And ironically, Marx is writing and he's like, socialism is, in the 19th century was really unrealistic and not very pragmatic. It is very unlikely that sort of institutions would change their character from the inside. And so Marx had written the sort of Communist Manifesto as a criticism of socialists and was like, we need to have a vanguard party that moves away from sort of the democracies that have been controlled by the bourgeoisie. Okay, the first sort of version of Marxism in political systems was in Russia. So the Bolsheviks put together sort of Marxist theory and practice within the Russian Revolution that happened in 1917, which is technically the first sort of creation of a communist government. There's a number of Marxist offshoots. They're oftentimes labeled like in research. You'll see Marxian, like M-I, like Marx and then IAN. That basically is a set of movements that follow a very similar line of thinking. So they tend to be critical of democracy. They tend to be fairly critical of private property ownership. Not just industrial sort of production, but follow sort of a similar line of thinking. Maybe have some divergencies about how sort of movements are constituted. So one of those that you might be familiar with is Maoism, right? Maoism had a pretty decent amount of purchase in African, Asian, and Latin American contexts, right? Maoism has similarities with Marxism because they, Maoists think that there needs to be a strong central authority, like a vanguard party, to take the sort of means of production and make it publicly available as a commons, right? The key difference between Maoists and Marx, they thought that Marx is writing in a Eurocentric context of the Industrial Revolution of factories. Mao was sort of talking in terms of agriculture. So he was sort of talking about an agrarian peasantry. So he was like, the peasant class is the one that sort of drives the revolution. So the Cultural Revolution, right, that people famously know about Mao, looks like sort of the peasant class challenging the comforts of the bourgeoisie. And actually, one of the quotes that was here for the elective, like the one that was like, a revolution is not writing an essay, it's not writing, doing art, et cetera, et cetera. That is a, Maoist, that is a quote from the Little Red Book, right? And he's like, the problem with sort of all of those approaches are there are sort of approaches by the capitalist class, not one that can be translated to peasant class or, agrarian farmers, right? It's like agrarian farmers doing art is not political, at least for Mao. Mao, is heralded to be like one of the big challenges to Western capitalist civilizations. And one of the sort of things that's interesting is that there is sort of a relationship between Maoism and basically non-Chinese contexts. So, there's quite a bit of relationship between the Black Panthers and Mao as well. So it's like Mao actually invited a bunch of Black Panthers to China to sort of try to organize, global solidarity. There was a Bandung conference that happened in like 1955 or 1958. A little shaky about that, but 1950s, where Asian, Latin American, and Black leaders who had communist beliefs came together and tried to sort of establish sort of this big sort of criticism of Western civilization. Okay, the reason why I kind of go on this like really random tangent is that the CAPK, I think, only recently has begun to innovate to include some of these other Marxian movements. And there are some benefits to sort of talking about your alternative in terms of that. So if you're thinking about reading, for example, Marxism K versus an affirmative that focuses on anti-Blackness, right? It might be much more persuasive to have a Maoist criticism because Mao does not necessarily think only capitalism matters. He thinks that it's about sort of a global underclass that has sort of racial tone, inflections, right? It's like the sort of the cradle of capitalist civilization is sort of the Western capitalist civilization that needs to be largely criticized. So it's like the set of arguments that are usually pretty persuasive against the Marxism critique by the AFF. That's like your movement doesn't sort of include Black folks, or your movement does not include X population, could be resolved by some of these Marxian offshoots. There are others. So it's like, obviously I mentioned Maoism. There's other sort of offshoots of Marxism as well. So Claudia Jones is sort of the person I think of in the United States, who's the tradition for Black feminist Marxism. Rosa Luxemburg in Germany and Teresa Ebert in the US, right, of a red feminism. You might be able to guess just based off of that what it is, right? Che Guevara, if you've seen him on a t-shirt, writes manifesto about like revolutionary asceticism in Latin America, right? So you should be able to find sort of different Marxian movements speaking in relationship to different intersections of violence. Even online, like if you look at Marxist.org, which is a literal website that has a bunch of these articles, it'll have articles that are sort of pushing sort of Marxist in things like disability studies or Marxist in gender studies. And that's sort of where you'll find some of your, best link arguments and alternative arguments. Does anybody have any questions so far about just like terminology? Like what is communism? What is socialism? What is capitalism? What's some of this history stuff? People feel okay about that? Ish. Okay, cool. Next section. So next section is going to be focused on just what is alienation. I think this is kind of a theme of Marxism that's been really underutilized in debate. So the thing people miss about Marx, and probably, because you're probably not reading Marx, is the philosophy of Hegel and his followers. I'm not going to do like a big Turner tangent on Hegel, but like just very quickly, Hegel in his sort of early writing, he's sort of describing the plight of wine growers and like the problem of Prussian wood theft. That his later sort of writings were focused less on politics and his approach is more philosophical, but it was this philosophy of history rather than a historical accounting with specificity. Sort of the thing that you need to know about that is that there's sort of this larger undercurrent of the importance of historical materialism, right? Historical materialism. Historical materialism sort of focuses on largely philosophical approach to history. How do we understand history, as opposed to just a series of unconnected events? Like we should sort of think about it in relationship to the formation of formations of economies and how they control some of those historical directions. Okay. I think the most sort of important text to sort of understand Marx, if you're like really interested in reading, is the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts. That's the one that Marx has, not necessarily the Communist Manifesto, which I think is most popular. It's weird because like the Communist Manifesto is just like this big diatribe against socialism, and I don't think that's like super useful in debates. The economic and political manuscripts are sort of like the place where he really sort of talks about the theory and sort of the thing that he does in that work is that he analyzes this idea of alienation under capitalism and then critiques Hegel. Okay. I'm not really going to bore the hell out of you about this, but sort of I'm going to give you like a quick definition of alienation and then the four kinds of alienation and sort of describe why they might be helpful to me. So, everyday definition of alienation. It would describe a feeling of separation from activities and environments we partake in. Okay. Alienation is a feeling of separation from activities and environments we partake in. So, negative affect that prevents us from getting up in the morning and being excited and, energized. Up until Marx wrote, alienation was considered to be kind of an individual problem or like just a negative state of mind. Okay. And some people were like, the way to sort of fix alienation, so like the feeling of detachment from your surroundings, was through religion. So to inspire people to sort of like work for a better goal and enable a sense of community through sort of a common belief, a shared belief in God, right? Along the same lines, Hegel actually makes this argument about the philosophy of spirit, that sort of consciousness is the way to overcome alienation. Okay. Marx was very critical of both of these ideas. So Marx was like alienation and sort of detachment from your surroundings is not really an individual problem. It's not really a state of mind or a consciousness that's like resolved by ideas, but as a result of material conditions of the political economy. So he turns from Hegel's idealism into materialism, historical materialism, right? Proposing that material circumstances are the things that drive ideas and enable alienation instead of the other way. Okay. And Marx sort of describes that there's four types of alienation that happens under capital that is distinct from any other type of economy. And I'll sort of list these one by one. So the first one is alienation from the product of our own labor. So alienation from the product of our own labor. So think about the difference between like a mom and pop, shoemaker and Nike, right? It's like mom and pop shoemaker, probably like a family business. Like they probably have run across generations. They probably build all the parts of the shoe from scratch, right? From start to finish. So they have artistic license over the product. They can claim ownership in the end. Nike is pretty different than that. So, let's say, I'm just going to use Klarman for this example since he's not here. If I tell Klarman, well, I'm running a Nike factory and I'm telling Klarman that he has to make an Air Force One, right? There's no situation in which Klarman can like start like creatively changing the Air Force One. Like that would be unacceptable, right? Like he would be creating from the blueprint that I provided as a factory, owner, being like, this is how an Air Force One is made, and you need to make it exactly the way it is, right? When he finishes making the product, after forever probably, it's no longer Klarman's Air Force One, right? It's actually my Air Force One because I own the factory. Like he does not have, ownership over that, product. So the entrepreneurs end up making the money, and the manual laborers do not really get a majority of that money, right? So sort of alienation from the product of our own labor is like we no longer have a connection to and are alienated from our own production, right? So it's like the things we produce, we're alienated from. The second aspect of alienation is alienation from the process of production. Alienation from the process of production. So capitalism and the factory setup that was sort of big in the Industrial Revolution really changed the way that we produce stuff. So Nike's not a family-run business, right? There's a pretty clear division between like the entrepreneurial class and the people that are making the shoe from scratch, right? When Nike sort of creates that Air Force One, you don't really have one person making the shoe from start to finish. So like if I'm trying to force Klarman to make an Air Force One, it's probably not the case. I'm going to be like, hey, Klarman, you're going to literally make the shoe from beginning to end, right? Usually the thing that happens within a factory is that the shoemaking task is sort of divided into bite-sized pieces of monotonous work, right? So like you might have, okay, let's say the entire DDI staff is now employed under Shree Nike factory owner. It's like you might have one person, so it's like Klarman, might be making the soles. And then Truth might be, stamping the soles with the Nike logo. And then Michaela might be, putting the laces in the shoes, et cetera, right? So the thing about sort of capitalism is that you basically are forced to do very monotonous work over and over again. So like at this point, Klarman only makes soles. Like he does not make the shoes. Like he makes like 10 million soles a day, right? And like Michaela's only tying laces, right? So the thing about that is sort of we're alienated, right, from the process of production because of the monotonous nature of our work. It's like the monotonous repetition makes it very difficult for you to connect with the product and care, right? It's like the manual laborer is doing this for whatever wages they're making, not because of the artistic, soul that they've created 1,000 times that they've been told to make by other people. Okay. The third type of alienation from other persons. Alienation from other persons. The reason why capitalism is so efficient is because the sort of the breakup and different monotonous activities makes it very difficult to collectivize. So if only one person does laces and only one person does the logo and only one person does soles and works in a physically different part of the factory, it's really hard to collectivize around specific demands about the workplace, right? So it's like the person who's like, man, the sole machine really sucks and like it really hurts my hand. It's like the rest of the people are like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't make soles. So like, that's not really a thing that I really care for to demand about. Right. So the sort of nefarious part about this is that, it makes it very difficult for people to unionize and have very similar demands, right? It's like their working conditions are pretty different because they're being forced to do very different things in very different parts of the factory. So, that's also sort of compounded by the fact that capitalist monopolies oftentimes resist unions because it would be more efficient if the working class did not revolt, right? So some companies might literally put them in different places, right, for a reason. They don't really want people to collectivize and start making demands. So they'll sort of try to alienate you from the people around you, not just the process of production. Final type of alienation. So this is the fourth type, fourth thesis of alienation. Alienation from species being. Alienation from species being, as in species, like species death, and being as in being. This one is probably the most abstract one, but the sort of argument is that human relations, have been reduced to market relationships. So relationships of exchange used to be pretty social, but then capitalism subsumes it into a monetary relationship. And so nature is taken away from humans. It alienates people from bodies, and they're sort of reduced to this concept of standing reserve. So like you might remember from the water topic, right? It's like you make sort of water into only a good a tool for human consumption as opposed to having any kind of intrinsic value. Similar to that here. It's like you are sort of alienated from your species being and nature, etc. So labor, at this point is not really creative, but only sort of concerned with possession or accumulation of wealth. Okay. Marx's solution to alienation in his early version of communism was in his manuscript. So he was like, the way to do this is that we should abolish private property. So we no longer have production sort of centered in that sort of factory fashion. And that the sort of relationship between private property and wage labor ensures workers can achieve universal human emancipation. So why did I just talk about alienation? So I think these alienation arguments are underutilized, sort of help as link turn, and sort of impact arguments for cap. So, alienation sort of link turns this idea that, for example, we don't have the energy to collectivize or we need like spiritual, belief or whatever, right? So like a lot of affirmatives will sort of make this claim that's just like, we need to focus on our particular identity group as a survival strategy because otherwise we won't have the energy to wake up in the morning. It's like, well, the reason why you might not have energy to wake up in the morning might have something to do with alienation, like the fact that you are forced to do create a product in a very monotonous way, that you're no longer able to relate to people in ways that are not coded by accumulation, that your production, if you do make it, like you no longer have connection to it. Those might be some of the reasons that drive alienation as opposed to just sort of identity politics, right? Alienation of sort of creative forms of labor, oftentimes will become sort of commoditized, monotonous, and dead. So there's like a sort of good turns case arguments to be made about sort of the way in which alienation from your own labor, right, becomes sort of abstracted from, what sort of you would like it to be. And it's sort of marketed in such a way that it does not end up sort of, helping you create, new things or anything like that. You have a question? Sorry. Good questions. I think there's like two approaches. One is, I don't think you necessarily want to say that it's the root cause or capitalism explains the whole thing. I think you should instead sort of describe this as capitalism does not solve the thing about sort of like, refilling energy, and it makes it impossible to collectivize around sort of, lefty resistance goals, like sort of the affirmative, right? So let's say the affirmative is focused on, I don't know, like fugitivity, right? It's very difficult for fugitives to get together if like the thing that we were sort of focused on, the backdrop of all of that is like we need to constantly accumulate wealth. We need to make sure that our relationships are monetized, that we can only do sort of monotonous work, right? It's like that's sort of the way that capitalist institutions are able to break up resistance by being like, oh, like, dude, you're still on the clock, right? It's like, like it's not time for resistance. It's not 5 o'clock yet, right? So that's like one way that you can talk about it, is like it's not so much that it explains it, it's more that it fractures any possibility of resistance. It turns the case. So like that's one answer. The other answer is, if you do want to sort of talk about in terms of the root cause, right? So if we're talking about the afterlife of slavery, policing, it's like it's not like those things came from nowhere, right? It's not like we suddenly decided one day that like we're just going to be mean to a certain set of people, and then like start basically exercising gratuitous cruelty, right? It's like afterlife of slavery is very much connected to sort of the idea of a plantation. That plantation is sort of center. It's the sort of center and driving motor of the economy at the time, right? And sort of policing practices have also sort of come from those plantation economies. It's like the sort of, yes, it's like they have now created sort of a life of their own, but it's like maybe the historical origin is capital. Final sort of thought about this is that, I talked a little earlier about sort of Marxian movements, right? I was like, you can have alternatives that are not race blind. So, like, if I pick, for example, there's a book titled Black Like Mao by Kelly Eshe. That book is very much focused on Maoist movements and sort of its relationship to the Black Panthers, et cetera. The reason why I bring it up is like you can have an alternative that's like we are both focused on race and capital, that we think that there's sort of this idea of a white capitalist civilization that we should criticize. The problem that we have with it is sort of the immaterial nature of the one I see. So remembering back to Mao being like revolution isn't writing an essay, it's like you can sort of be like one AC is basically revolution writing an essay. The one NC is sort of the vanguard party. We need to have sort of governance structures. It might even need to be a dictatorship of the proletariat or dictatorship of the peasantry, and that's sort of the thing that's important. And then it's like it solves both sort of the race and class elements of the act. So those are like my three answers. My suggestion when you're debating is like mix and match some of those. So like some folks are pretty good at being like capitalism explains all of it, and like we'll do a historical deep dive on your stuff. Other people are like less willing to be like capitalism literally explains all part of race, just because it's kind of difficult to really win that argument. And they'll be like, capitalism will turn the case. It makes it very difficult to sort of establish resistance movements because of alienation. And the alternative is able to resolve because it'll include sort of both. Hopefully that answers your question, Lauren. Cool. Okay. Yeah, Michi. Sorry, repeat that. That is a root cause argument. I'm saying like there are multiple approaches. Like one is like just like capitalism turns the case, which is like the first bit. Second is like you could debate the root cause stuff if you feel confident about it. And then third is like an alternative that just solves the AF as well as capitalism. That kind of makes sense. Yeah. Like there are some cases that are easier than others, I think, for the root cause thing. So it's like I think if you're like debating someone that is more historically describing like the process of plantation economies, you might be able to like read a couple of cards. It's like the sort of origin of a plantation economy is sort of based on the transition from feudalism to the industrial revolution is kind of the midway point and like is maybe explained by capital, and a lot of the reasons how policing happens, how sort of prison sentences are determined, right? All of that is also related to capital because of sort of like economies within prison. So it's like you can maybe make that argument, but it's like less good in other cases, right? So let's say an AF is like focused on like individual violence in the debate community and is like, framework debaters, call me bad names. It's like, does capitalism explain that? Like, yeah, probably not. So it's like, that's not the greatest, place to go strategically. And it makes more sense for then, your link arguments to be focused on, the method, and then your alternative to have sort of a race conscious view of Maoism or something like that, if that makes sense. Okay, last part of this, we're going to talk a little bit about the debating of this. Okay, so a couple of thoughts about this. So for the Marxism K, I think I would avoid having very large overviews. I don't think you need to like explain the theory of or history of Marxism. Marxism. Like you don't need to do my lecture before you get into the line by line. Like that's unworkable. I think the overview that you sort of want should be short and should just be an extension of the impact. So usually it will be something like capitalism outweighs one, extinction, like climate change, resource wars, whatever else that capitalism causes everybody to die. That's a bigger scope than the 1AC. The second thing they usually want in that cap overview is like you want some sort of like capitalism turns the case argument. Okay, so and this is I think pretty vital. Usually gets dropped, and it's also the central thing in your 2NR. So you should think about sort of like how does capitalism and its forms of alienation preclude the possibility of resistance? So like that's one way to think about the turns case argument. Another way to think about the turns case argument is like the root cause thing that we just talked about, right? So it's just like maybe capitalism explains the thing that you were sort of talking about. Finally, you might talk about sort of how the terminal impact maybe turns the case. It's like, the climate change that occurs from capitalism likely affects the marginalized population the one AC is describing, right? And that's it. So impact overview should just be cap outweighs, it's big, and it turns the case, period. No other things. The only other thing that you might include is if your alt is a little different, like it's a little bit more, different than other debates. So it's like, let's say that I'm reading a Maoist alternative. It's like I might have a CISA point that's just like the alternative doesn't link to offense. Maoism explicitly includes, the Black radical tradition, including like solidarity with Black power. Like we don't think that race is totally explained by class. The sort of key question of the debate is whether or not our strategy should be horizontal versus vertical. So like if I'm, making a Maoist argument, I might be like, this is actually like a fairly common link argument that we try to drive. A lot of affirmatives, right, will try to make the argument that governmentality is bad or just like the state is bad. And like you might be able to generate a link argument that's just like, well, like we think the state's good. It just needs to be a dictatorship of the proletariat. In fact, it should be an autocratic state. An autocratic state is good, right? So it's like you can make sort of link arguments like that where it's like our argument is not race doesn't matter. Our argument is about method. So it's like, is it horizontal or vertical? Is it autocratic or no government, right? Anarchic, right? That's sort of the way that you might generate the set of your links. The rest of the debate should be on the line by line. Okay, so it's like you just do the impact overview. Maybe you explain your alternative slightly differently, but like that's about it. Then you should sort of get to sort of the line by line. All the link arguments you make should be on the permutation because permutations test links. Okay. And everything else, that they sort of say, you should say one of the following three things. Okay. You should say one, either sort of, Cap is able to explain the thing that they talked about better. So it's like if they're like, here's this alt takeout, like, you don't consider this, it's like maybe capitalism explains it better. If capitalism doesn't explain it better, maybe the link turns the case and makes it worse, right? So like if they're like, you create a situation where like people don't have the energy to wake up in the morning. It's like, yeah, okay, like capitalism may or may not explain that, but the link that's like capitalism requires monotonous work, separation of people, certainly is able to turn that impact and make it worse, right? The second thought is you should say that the alternative solves. Okay, the alternative can self-correct and assume the bad thing. So maybe they're like, Marxist movements have historically been pretty bad to Black women. It's like time to make some arguments that the alternative is able to solve and could include the voices of Black women. So, like Claudia Jones is the example of the sort of Black feminist Marxism that I talked about before, right? And one of the sort of key things here is like you want to make sure that you have examples about like each sort of subset of the population that you can go for in any given debate. This might sound a little stupid, but like even like Wikipediaing it like before a debate is of great importance. So it's like it's not good if you're like getting surprised for the first time going for the Marxism K. I'm like, oh yeah, like turns out Marxist movements haven't so great to disabled people. It's like, well, yikes, like you're about to lose because they have an example and you probably have absolutely none, right? So it's like, Wikipedia is probably your first stop. Like if you can find some alt cards that are specific to the subset group and the area of Marxism, that's the best. But it's like if you don't have that card, even just going and finding some examples of like if you're debating an ability half about disability, it's like disabled activists who are Marxists. It's like even knowing that is quite good, right? You're in a better place than if you're just like, yeah, we're just gonna wing this, right? And then finally, the third thing that you can say to one of the arguments on the line by line is simply that it's a new link. Okay, it's a new link. So some folks will talk about sort of the importance of energy. You might be like, the problem with your approach is that it is a new link because you sort of conceive of energy as something that is spiritual, right? So it's like, it's this mystical thing that like you wake up with in the morning as opposed to something that is a material output, right? So it's like, remember where I talked about earlier, I was like, alienation, people used to think it was, you were able to sort of recover your energy through consciousness. It's like Marxists disagree. It's like your consciousness is not enough. It's like it sort of occludes the fact that there's sort of material inputs into those things. So it's like you can make arguments that they're a new link. Or another sort of example, people will say their stuff is a survival strategy. There's pretty good link arguments that say sort of the concept of a survival strategy is very much capitalist. It sort of is focused on individual survival. And it also sort of is presumed on the idea that we should just adapt to our circumstances as opposed to revolting to the circumstances that exist. So it's like, if, evidence is like, we need to endure the violence that exists. It's like, well, endurance just means like you're going to keep the system intact and not ever revolt because you think that the only thing you can do is endure, right? And maybe that's sort of a capitalist lie that's been fed to you that is bad. Okay. Final part of debating this, you must debate the case. You must debate the case. It is unacceptable to go for the cap K and just the cap K. Like, it doesn't work like that. Largely because usually in the case, there's like a case overview that has like an impact that is likely pretty big and tries to bracket out your offense. So it's like you have to go to the case and answer it. Few sort of thoughts about what kinds of things to put. I think a lot of times people don't think about how their case debate interacts with their Marxism K. So it's like if your Marxism K is like a little bit more general, it's like talking about historical materialism, history. It's like takeouts on the case that are like critiques fail, like need strong state is like worthless because like those two things don't go together. Or like if you're reading a Maoist alt about dictatorship of the proletariat, cards on the case that are like democratic reforms are really good. They helped us like get to these X, Y, and Z things are pretty stupid because it's like one is about autocracy and one is about democracy, right? So it's like you don't want to be in a situation that sort of is like that. So you want to make sure that your case cards that you're going for, at least in the 2NR makes sense, right? Another common one, people really like the ballot K on the case, right? They'll be like, oh yeah, AF does nothing. Like what could a ballot do to change, our perspectives on things? And it's like, okay, so on the all to the capitalism K, like the more we learn about like Marxism and like, err towards, these kinds of skills, the better we become as like ethical subjects. It's like, what happened? It's like, I thought the whole point was like ballots don't do anything. Ethical subjects aren't created by debate. So it's like, you want to make sure that like the things you're going for ultimately in the 2NR make sense with the critique you're extending. So it's like, the set of things that you probably need on case, like you probably need on case that, the theory that they've described is not all encompassing. So it's like, if the AF is about Afro-pessimism, like anti-blackness explains the entirety of a relationship with civil institutions. Well, it's probably time to read some cards that are like, no, the anti-blackness is not the only thing. And in fact, that is a problem. There's a set of link arguments that you've established on your Marx K. Or if your Marx K is more socialist, it's like, yeah, you can have some cards that like reforms are good. Democratic reforms are able to resolve things. If your thing is more Maoist, it's like you might have some, cards that are just thinking about stuff. So like going back to the revolution is not writing an essay quote. It's I can read the cards that are like just thinking about stuff and writing essays on things is not particularly conducive to any kind of politics and doesn't do anything. It's like that pairs well with Mao's argument. It's like we need to sort of think about establishing a dictatorship and establishing sort of a party that top down determines things. Right. So it's like you need a case debate, but the case debate needs to make sense with the people. Any questions? Yeah.
I guess the most specific points that you mentioned the black Maoism and black Marxism for several years. I guess how would you answer the argument to the communism? Because most people don't like to focus in on that as much. So they'll read sort of anti-document scholars who are more open to like multi-faceted or don't necessarily exclude
I think the thing that you want to look out for is like you want to look for links to some of their methods. So it's like open-ended usually actually is a pretty good sign for the CapK because it's like your openness is likely to invite some capitalists in. So it's like if it's literally just like we're open in like multiple ways of being and stuff, it's like, well, the black Maoism K is like black capitalists are also not great. So it's like you might still be able to generate a set of link arguments to capitalism. The other sort of thought is like you might think about just like what are, there are probably some things that you can establish with cross-examination pretty quickly and the team will just fold. Like, so like, for example, I might start with being like, so does the, affirmative, could it ever, be something that could be done with NATO? It's like, my guess is the answer to that question is probably going to be no, because it has to be, right? So it's like, you might be able to find a set of link arguments that are just like, so this is pretty funny. There is a set of articles that's like we should reclaim NATO as like a socialist NATO. Like right now it's capitalist. Like there are sort of socialist governments in a bunch of European places. So like we should go and try to, basically steal away NATO from the capitalists. That's a little crazy, but it's like that's one version. Another version might be like if you're like, so like, is any state action something that is compatible with the F? It's like most teams will likely say no to that question as well because it's pretty difficult to be like, oh yeah, you can have state action, but we're not topical. It's like it starts to make no sense, right? So it's like once they're like no state action, you can establish a link argument that's like, well, black Maoists certainly think you need to use the state and or create a new state, perhaps even a more dictatorial one that is likely going to exclude like the sort of multiple beings of blackness that could feed into capital. Final part is like you might have links to sort of the style in which they've approached their things. So like there are links to like poetry. It's easily commodifiable within a capitalist economy. There are links to sort of focusing on performance, on spirituality, whatever sort of the affirmative is focused on. You might be able to sort of generate link arguments that are specific to the way that they have performed their thing, and then sort of make arguments that are just like that is sort of the point of mutual exclusivity with the alternative. So that's kind of the three ways I would say for the film.